So when preparing what to talk about today, I really wasn't sure how basic to make it in terms of like, I don't know what your sort of baseline knowledge level on this subject is. So we'll see. If I say anything that seems too obvious to you, then I apologize, and it probably won't be too obvious to everyone. If it is too obvious to everyone, then that's great. That means you already know a lot. So I want to start with the title of this talk, Rehauling Perceptions of Women in the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, the first thing we have is, as a category, this is problematic, which we'll see, right? I mean, we're not really sure exactly what this means, women in the Middle East and North Africa, right? But let's start with the first part, which is perceptions. So all of you have some perceptions of women in the Middle East. And there's going to be reasons for that. Hold on. How do I? Okay. So I want to start with something like an anecdote. This is the back cover blurb of a novel from 2007 by a Saudi woman writer called Girls of Riyadh. This novel is, for all intents and purposes, chick lit, right? So it's basically was billed as a kind of Sex in the City, but in Arabic and in Saudi Arabia. So let's just look at the way this was advertised on the back cover. Okay, so we have this groundbreaking novel opens up the world of the Saudi woman to the rest of us. Now, for the first time, we are able to understand their conflicts, struggles, and frustrations, their hopes, beliefs, and dreams. Okay, something might strike you about this, right? Like, so, okay, generally when you're advertising a work of literature, you maybe will advertise its universality, right? Or maybe some kind of literary quality, right, of the text, right? Marketing actually makes a difference. What do we see is being marketed here exactly, right? We're opening up the world of Saudi women to the rest of us, right? So what it is this is the whole point of the novel, right? And this is also a significant thing because it's very, very difficult for an Arabic novel to be translated into English by a mainstream publisher, right? This was published by Penguin Books, okay? This was on the New York Times bestseller list in translation. This was widely marketed, right? You could go into a Barnes & Noble or whatever and you could find this novel. That's not usually the case with Arabic fiction. Usually Arabic fiction is published in English by specialist press and read by academics or people with, particular interests. It's not usually marketed to the English-speaking public as a whole, right? But this was appealing to Western audiences because it promised a view into the closed, cloistered world of Saudi women, right, or Arab women, right? So you have to think about, what does that mean? What does that mean that we already think we're going to find in the closed and cloistered world of Arab women, right? And there's a whole history behind the assumptions that go behind this, that lead to a back cover blurb like this. Have you guys, for example, had anyone talk to you yet about Orientalism? One person's nod or shake. Okay, no one is shaking their head, so I don't know what that means, but okay. So we have to think about first, like, because again, this is about, dismantling or unhauling perceptions of Middle Eastern women, right? So we first want to think about what are those perceptions already that we have about Middle Eastern women and where do they come from, right? So you have the book Orientalism, right, which you might have heard of, published in 1978 by a Palestinian-American critic named Edward Said, right? And this is where we basically redefine the word Orientalism to describe a pervasive Western tradition of both academic discourse, right, and artistic representation of kind of outside biased perceptions of the Middle East that go hand in hand with European imperialism in the 18th and 19th centuries, right? So this is the way Europe is viewing the Middle East in the 18th and 19th centuries, right, at the moment that they're launching their imperial colonial projects. And this is the time where, like, the Middle East, right, which Edward Said, when he talks about the Orient, of course, he's talking about the Middle East, right? He's not talking about East Asia. The Orient and Orientalism, at least in his definition of the term, right, is the Middle East, North Africa, right? And this is a time where, like, these representations get created of the Middle East in various ways. And this is the way that the West basically defines itself through a series of oppositions, right? Meaning that, okay, if we sort of imagine the Middle East to be barbaric, right, this helps us to imagine the West as civilized in opposition, right? Or if we imagine the Middle East to be overly religious, right, and kind of racked with religious fanaticism, we get to imagine the West as secular in opposition, right? If you imagine the Middle East as overly sexualized, as a lot of people did, especially in the 19th century. And you have to remember, this is also like 19th century England is part of this, right? So you have Victorian England where everything is very puritanical, right? So in opposition to the very straight-laced culture of Victorian England, right, you have over-sexualized images of the Middle East, right? So basically this means that these representations that we get of the Middle East in literature, in scholarly texts, in paintings, right, have very little to do with the actual Middle East and everything to do with the way Europe views itself, right? So this is essentially a narcissistic project in a way, right? This is sort of Europe defining itself against the Middle East. This is where a lot of our ideas about Middle Eastern women come from, right? Subconsciously, often, maybe, right? So if you take, for example, you have a lot of Orientalist art. So you have a whole series of paintings. You have a lot of these paintings that were produced in especially the 19th century. So you have here, for example, by Delacroix, Women of Algiers in Their Apartment. Okay, so what might we notice about this representation? Well, I mean, you first might notice that, like, the women basically look like European women. They don't particularly look like Middle Eastern women at all, right? But the idea is that it's going to be sort of exotic, colorful, sensual. You're always going to have these male artists painting what they imagine to be the inside spaces of the harem, right? Where you just sort of have women kind of laying around. This one is relatively tame because the women are at least clothed, right? There's going to be some where the women are not clothed. So if you don't want to view that, then cover your eyes, right? But if we sort of look at other ones, right? Like, okay, we can look at a Renoir that was sort of done in dedication to the image that we just saw, right? Where again, you have the same thing, right? You have these women who are supposed to kind of represent Middle Eastern women who are kind of laying around in the harem, in this case, in various states of undress. Here we have another one by an Italian artist in this case called Picking the Favorite, right? And you can sort of see the kind of visual spectacle, right? Where sort of women become the visual spectacle here. You often have these kind of salacious scenes like this, right? Public baths, slave auctions, which is what we have here. So you end up getting the Orientalist portrait being associated with these kind of European nudes that are almost pornographic. But this is the sort of these are the representations of the Middle East, and especially Middle Eastern women, who become a favorite subject that are circulating in Europe, especially in the 19th century. Here's another one by the same artist, 19th century, called The Harem Dance. Okay, so, you know, these scenes like this, right, like, it should be clear, like, these have no grounding really in reality at all, right? Like, these are, first of all, these sort of the spaces that were reserved for women in the Middle East, European men obviously had no access to, right? I mean, Arab men didn't have access to, or Middle Eastern, you know, these are sort of women's spaces. So these are completely like sort of male fantasies, European male fantasies about what's happening in these spaces, right? And, you know, some of the decor has some sort of degree, you know, there's some kind of representation that's grounded in reality, right? Like the tile work and the carpets, right? But even the clothing that the women are wearing, right? Like often have very little to do with anything that Middle Eastern women are wearing. Nevertheless, right, these are images that, whether you know it or not, have some influence on the way you imagine the Middle East, most of you, or most people, right? And we can see it, for example, right? An image that everyone is probably aware of, right, is sort of our Princess Jasmine from Aladdin, right, from Disney's version of the 1001 Nights, which also, again, if you look at the clothes, look at what she's wearing, which looks really similar to these kind of harem pants that we have our figure here wearing. That again, this has nothing to do with anything anybody in the Middle East was actually wearing, right? But I teach the 1001 Nights to university students all the time, and all of my students know this movie, and basically all of my students have kind of accepted this movie as an unproblematic representation, if not realistic. Nevertheless, there's a lot of fondness for this movie, right? So like these images have, some effect on your kind of unconscious idea of women in the Middle East, whether you sort of realize it or not. So we have this kind of problem of perception, right? And you have something interesting too, in that we have the problem of perception. We have these two very contradictory representations that shouldn't be able to coexist, yet they do, right? So on the one hand, we have the idea of the kind of harem as a very sexualized, sensual space, right? Where women are kind of maybe dressed like this, right? You can buy Halloween costumes if you're in the States, for example, that look like this. On the other hand, right, you have this other idea of women as being, kind of completely covered in various ways. And you have a strange interest, at least in the Western media, about what Muslim women are wearing, right? There's almost an obsession, right? And even countries like France attempt to kind of regulate this through various laws, right? Either around the hijab, right, where I think it was maybe around 2003 or 2004, where they started, kind of banning the hijab in certain places in France, or you had even last year, right, this sort of rhetoric around the burkini, right, where nobody wanted women to suddenly wear the burkini, right? For some reason, people are very interested in what women from this region are wearing, and they tend to want to regulate it in the West, right? So and all of these different categories of Islamic dress tend to be elided into one, right? Like the burqa, which is Afghanistan, the niqab, the shadur, which is Iran, the hijab. I have many people who, when I tell them that I've been living in Egypt or Morocco, wherever, they'll sort of ask me, oh, did I have to wear a burqa? And it's like, okay, no, but anyway, like that's like an Afghani thing, and I don't understand why this is the first thing you ask about the country, but it is, right? So you have these two representations that are actually completely opposite that kind of form our perceptions of women in the region, right? Both of these things are really problematic. But so just to say that we're not exactly starting from zero when we want to think about, say, women in the Middle East, right? We're kind of starting from -0, and we're starting from a lot of stuff that we want to kind of undo or try to not think about. Okay, so now let's think about another thing about this title, right? When we think about, okay, rehauling perceptions of women in the Middle East and North Africa. There are some other problems with the category, right? In that this has to be a title for a talk. It's a really important subject, but actually it shouldn't be a title for a talk because it doesn't actually mean anything, right? So the fact, we're again in a kind of contradictory position where we have to talk about this, but this is not a category actually, right? That we should be talking about. Because first we have to ask, which country, which region, right? What does this mean? Can we possibly talk about women in Saudi Arabia in the same way as we talk about women in Lebanon, as we talk about women in Iran, or women in Pakistan, or women in any part of the larger Islamic world? It doesn't make any sense to sort of group these. You cannot talk about this as though it's a kind of homogenous thing, right? So we need to ask first, like, which country, which region, where? What are we even talking about, right? Then another difference, right? Are urban or rural, right? Are we talking about women in the city, or are we talking about women in the countryside? Because norms, gender norms in, say, Cairo are completely different than what you're going to find if you go to Upper Egypt, right? Gender norms in Beirut are different than what you're going to find if you go into a village, right? But the same with Casablanca, right? You can't compare Casablanca to what you're going to find if you go out into rural Morocco, right? Like the difference between city, urban versus rural in terms of so many things, but especially in terms of women, right, is enormous, right? So this is something else we'd have to think about for it to mean anything. Which time period, right? Because then one of the things that happens is that the Middle East, right, because we have all of these kind of holdover perceptions from colonialism, from these images that have been circulating in Western popular culture for like several centuries at this point, right, is that it ends up being dehistoricized, right? And we don't think about like, okay, when? What are we, we can't, are we going to talk about 2017 the same way we would talk about, say, 2000 or 1960 or 1900 or 1850 or what? I mean, because this, again, without historicizing which period, as a question, it doesn't actually mean anything, right? There are also limits, right, to categories like Middle East, Arab world, Islamic world, right? Just as there are limits to the category of the nation state. If we're even trying to think, say, about like, okay, this nation state versus another nation state, I'm sure you guys all know, right? The nation state in the Middle East is a really new thing, right? So at what point can we even talk about national entities, right? The 20th century, right, where we can say talk about Iraq as a nation state, right? Egypt as a nation state. Also, gender, right? Gender, women, what does this mean? Right, because women, the category of women only exists in relation to other categories, right? Like sexuality, right? Are we assuming that all women are straight, right? That to be a woman in the Middle East or the MENA region means to be a heteronormative woman, right? We can't at all assume that, right? Are we assuming there's no relationship to class, right? In the same way that we have to think about the difference between urban and rural, we have to think about the difference in social class, right? Someone who's in the kind of elite, right? There's very little relationship between someone who's like an urban elite and someone who's, a kind of peasant in the countryside. Like but we can't lump both of these categories into just women. Okay, and then another thing, right, is that Islam isn't necessarily the thing that defines being a woman in the Middle East, right? Because this is also a thing is that you initially think like, okay, women in the MENA region, so maybe then I'm talking about issues that have to do with Islam. I mean, for some people, right? But for some people, no. Right? Many Muslim women do not, this is not necessarily the most important aspect of their identity, right? Many Muslim women are various degrees of being secular, right? Also, there are lots and lots of people in the MENA region who are not Muslim at all, right? Which I'm sure you've learned about, right? Like I'll sort of look here. And we have Jewish populations, we have Christian populations, right? You have, other religious categories also if you sort of move into, especially if you move out of the MENA region into the larger Islamic world. But let's just sort of look, for example, think about demographics, right? And these are really approximate because we probably know the Middle East, like we don't really get, you don't really get sort of update census reporting, right? So we don't have accurate census data for most places in the Middle East. But if we approximate, right, like just take Bahrain, we think probably around 14.5% Christian, right? Egypt, around 15% Christian, but in Egypt's big, so that means, between 15 to 21 million people, right? We have Iraq before the fall of Saddam Hussein, 7% Christian, right? Jordan, approximately 6% Christian. Lebanon, approximately 40.5% Christian, although I think the official tally probably has it higher than that, right? Syria, approximately 11.2% Christian. Sorry. Okay, so if these are the kind of numbers, right, and this is, excluding, say, Jewish population, this is excluding, I mean, what then does it mean to say talk about women in the Middle East, right? When we have so many different types of identity that are in play, right? And then I also just want to just take a look at a map, right? And say like, okay, the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa, well, we could be talking about, the Middle East, North Africa proper, right? But then also we could be thinking about the larger Islamic world, right? Where if we're thinking about issues that maybe pertain to Islam, right, then we maybe need to also widen our geographical scope, right? Because the larger Islamic world is a lot larger than the Middle East and North Africa. Okay, so these were the first So as I was thinking about like, okay, what to even talk about when we talk about, say, women in the Middle East, these are all of the different things that came to mind, right? Where I said, I don't even know, where do you start? Where do you start from? Because as a category, it's not that much more useful than, say, talking about just like women overall, right? Which, like, how do you talk about just women without differentiating further? Okay. I should bring up also, when I say that Islam is not, it is not necessarily a question of Islam that we're interested in, right? Is that you can't assume that the issues that are even most affecting women's lives in any of the MENA countries at any given time have very much to do with Islam, because this is not necessarily an issue of, say, Islamic law, right? Like, and I'm sure you know, right, that a lot of the laws that are in place, especially the laws that got put into place after the colonial period or with the colonial period, right, are not coming from Islamic law. So even when it comes to sort of thinking about what is actually governing, what is actually affecting the lives of women in these places, you have to take it by a case-by-case, country-by-country basis and figure out, like, okay, what is actually the legal code, right? What are the laws that are affecting women? And this is often a lot more important than, say, thinking about just a larger, maybe Islamic identity. Okay. That said, I'm going to use the rest of my time to just maybe talk a little bit anecdotally, right? And I am actually going to talk about women in Islam, because that's the majority, right? But after sort of saying that, like, this is a problematic way, in a sense, to approach this topic. But there's no way to approach this topic that doesn't need qualifications, right? But since it's the majority in a lot of these places, right, like, we can maybe think about some women in Islamic history, and then we'll also we'll think about a few contemporary women, right? And again, to proceed by anecdote is also a problem, right? I mean, but there's no way around this, right? Because we can't completely generalize. But let's think about some important figures in, say, Islamic history, right? That might be contra to some of your perceptions of women's place in Islam, right? Okay, so you have, for example, Khadija, right? Some of you are going to know who Khadija is. Maybe, do all of you know who Khadija is? Nod. Nod if you know. Okay, and do nothing if you don't know, since people don't want to shake their heads no, that's okay. So Khadija, right, she's a really, really important figure in the Islamic world, right? And she was the first wife of Muhammad, right? Married to him for 25 years. She was married two times before Muhammad, widowed both times, right? She had children from all of her marriages. She was a successful merchant, right? It's said that when the Quraysh's trade caravans gathered to embark upon their summer journey to Syria or winter in Yemen, her caravan equaled the caravans of all the other traders of the Quraysh put together, right? So here we have a wealthy businesswoman, right, who's already been married twice and has children. She didn't travel herself with her caravans. She employed others to trade on her behalf for commission. So in 595, she needed an agent, right, to go with her caravan in Syria. So she asked a relative, or a relative recommended to her Muhammad, right, who would come to be the prophet, because he had already had experience working with caravans, right? And he had a reputation for being really, really trustworthy, right? So she hires Muhammad, who we think was then 25, right? And she sends one of her servants to assist him on this caravan. And the person that she sent, her agent who was assisting him, said really good things about him afterwards, and said that, like, she had also seen several signs on the journey, right? Like he sat, for example, to rest under a tree, and he was seen by a passing monk who said, like, nobody but a prophet had ever sat beneath this tree. So there were these sort of signs of maybe future prophethood, future greatness on this journey. So she was told this when he got back, right? And she heard all of these great things about him. So then she consulted her cousin and said that, okay, if this is true, then, Muhammad is probably chosen by God, etc. And then she had the idea that she should perhaps propose marriage, right? Now, this is not necessarily what we think of when we think of Islam, right? I'm guessing, right? Maybe some of you do, but this is not what your average person, right? So, then she basically entrusts a friend to ask Muhammad, like, would he consider this prophet? She was like very beautiful. She was very sought after. She was turning down lots of people who wanted to marry her, right? So she initiated this contact with Muhammad, asking him like, okay, is this something that you would consider? And he did, and then he went and proposed, right? But this was initiated by her, already an independent, wealthy businesswoman, right? Who decided that, Muhammad would be a good husband. And you can see now, so this little quote is from Ibn Ishaq's. So Ibn Ishaq is, if you ever wanted to read the biography of the Prophet, this would be the earliest possible source you could read, right? The earliest source that's still intact, if you want to sort of find out firsthand about the Prophet. And then this is what was written about Khadija, right? Khadija was a merchant woman of dignity and wealth. She used to hire men to carry merchandise outside the country on a profit-sharing basis. For the Quraysh were a people given to commerce. Now when she heard about the Prophet's truthfulness, trustworthiness, and honorable character, she sent for him and proposed that he should take her goods to Syria and trade with them, while she would pay him more than she paid the others, right? Okay, so this is the official account, right? So this is like, when you read Islamic Arabic historiography, right, we sort of know that, okay, this is Khadija. And she was the first person to convert to Islam, so she was the first person to believe him, right? And she was a support throughout their 25-year marriage. Okay, I want to get through some other stuff, so I don't want to spend too much time on some of these other figures because I want to make sure I'm able to address the modern figures. But okay, let me just sort of briefly go over Aisha, right? Aisha, another really important woman in Islamic historiography and Islamic culture, right? So Khadija died, the Prophet then took other wives, right? Not until after Khadija's death, right? Aisha was his third wife. And we can just a few points about Aisha, right? Okay. More than 2,000 hadith, which you probably know, like hadith, right, are the sayings and doings of the Prophet that form one of the main pillars of Islamic law, right? So more than 2,000 hadith are attributed to Aisha, right? And the whole way a hadith can be valid or not valid, right, is based on the credibility of the person to whom it's attributed. Right? So everything about a hadith, whether it's weak or strong, is all about, do we have faith in the person who said this, right? So more than 2,000 of these are actually attributed to Aisha, right? She was the main source of support for the Prophet in the second half of his life through his immigration to Medina and a number of battles, right? She helped establish women's right to choose her husband. She withstood outside slander, resulting in Quranic decrees favoring women, right? And she fought in actual battles, right? Like literally. And she was known for her scholastic aptitude. She gave lectures and had many people coming to study with her, etc., right? And here's an image of her that's a little blurry, but you can see this is Aisha battling the fourth Caliph Ali at the Battle of the Camel that's named after her camel. And this is a miniature from a Turkish epic about Muhammad from the 16th century, right? So she was actually like in the trenches, literally fighting. Okay, the importance of figures like this. So I'm going to give you just a quote from Reza Aslan, who some of you might know, right? Who's like a very, he had a TV show and stuff. Important scholar of religion, but also a media personality, right? We have to think these figures are also important to, say, contemporary Muslim feminists, right? And I'll say, okay, this is his quote. The so-called Muslim women's movement is predicated on the idea that Muslim men, not Islam, have been responsible for the suppression of women's rights. For this reason, Muslim feminists throughout the world are advocating a return to the society Muhammad originally envisioned for his followers. Despite differences in culture, nationalities, and beliefs, These women believe that the lesson to be learned from Muhammad in Medina is that Islam is above all an egalitarian religion. Their Medina is a society in which Muhammad designated women as spiritual guides for the ummah or community, in which the Prophet himself was sometimes publicly rebuked by his wives, in which women prayed and fought alongside the men, in which women like Aisha acted not only as religious but also as political and on at least one occasion military leaders, and in which the call to gather for prayer bellowed from the rooftop of Muhammad's house brought men and women together to kneel side by side and be blessed as a single undivided community. So it is women like Khadija, Aisha, right, that a lot of contemporary scholars of Islamic thought or feminists in the Arab world turn to, right, to try to offer a feminist interpretation of Islam, right? So these are important figures for a lot of people. Okay, I was going to talk about the 1001 Nights, but I don't really have time, so I won't. Okay, I just want to point out a few contemporary feminists, and these are also people that you should read if you have not read already. And this is canonical. So the two I'm going to mention right now are like absolutely canonical. This is like, you know, kind of feminism in the Arab world, one-on-one. So the first is Nawal Saadawi, born in 1931 in a small Egyptian village, right? And her family was at once traditional and progressive, right? So Saadawi was circumcised at the age of 6. You've probably all heard of female circumcision, which is something that the West likes to talk about a lot. It is only specific, it only happens in like particular regions, usually in Africa. So like it does happen sometimes in Egypt. Again, the different categories we need to think about, right? She's from a small, poor, rural village, right? Like she's not from Cairo, even though she later moved to Cairo. So she graduated as a medical doctor in 1955 from Cairo University. And it was through medical practice in the countryside that she observed, you know, the sort of physical and psychological problems that a lot of women had there. And it was while she was working as a doctor in the village that she was born in that she started to become more of a kind of political activist, right? She is also a novelist. So she was at one time the director of the Ministry of Public Health in Egypt, right? In 1972, she published a really important book in Arabic called Women and Sex, confronting and contextualizing various aggressions perpetrated against women's bodies, including female circumcision, right? This book has basically become a foundational text in second wave feminism, right? But as a consequence of that book and her larger political activities, she was dismissed from her position at the Ministry of Health. She was imprisoned by Anwar Sadat in Egypt, right, but was released shortly thereafter. She did, though, write a book based on those experiences called Memoirs of a Women's Prison. All of this is available in English, right? And she's also a novelist, so you should consider reading her, right? And she has said, "Danger has been a part of my life ever since I picked up a pen and wrote. Nothing is more perilous than truth in a world that lies." She was also among the protesters in Tahrir Square in 2011. So she's quite old now, if you can see her birth date, 1931, but she's still really active. Another figure that you should consider, that we want to consider, right, or who you should also read is Fatima Mernissi. And Fatima Mernissi and Nawal Saadawi are basically of the same generation, except Fatima Mernissi is Moroccan. Fatima Mernissi, and here you also see some of the differences. Both of these women, by the way, I mean, they would consider themselves Muslim, right? So, but Fatima Mernissi, being Moroccan and from a different background, right, has a slightly different take on activism than Nawal Saadawi. Now, Fatima Mernissi is exactly one of these types, right, who tries to think back to Islamic history, like Aisha, like Khadija, like some of these other figures who were very powerful during the Prophet's time, right? And she tries to rewrite this history from a feminist perspective and basically read all of the problems that there's been with women's rights in the Arab world subsequently as a problem with, you know, kind of male interpretation, right? rather than a problem with the source texts themselves and what was actually happening at the time of Muhammad's community, right? So you can see this, she has a book called Beyond the Veil and the Male Elite, right? You can sort of see this in the title, right? She wants to sort of think beyond. It is the male elite that has caused all of these problems in the way Islamic history has developed for her, right? Again, this is in English. She actually wrote this book in French, right? But this is available in English. And you can see exactly the way she tries to appropriate these figures for her own political progressive agenda. Okay. I just want to talk about someone really contemporary and give you some things to look at before I finish here, right? Okay, this is Dua al-Adl. And so Nawala Saadawi and Fatima Mernissi are really old school, right? These are your kind of like, you know, foundational 20th century feminist thinkers in the Arabic Islamic tradition. This person, you can see she's quite a bit younger, right? And she's working now. She's currently Egypt's probably the most famous cartoonist in Egypt right now. And you can see she's been awarded a lot of awards. She is publishing in, you know, half a dozen different Egyptian papers every day. You can find her work just by searching her name in English. And I'm going to show you some of these images so you can see what she does. And also, by the way, notice, unlike, you know, Fatima al-Mernissi and Nawala Saadawi, you know, she wears the hijab, right? So you can't also kind of assume that a woman who is a political activist in any of these places is going to look any particular way. Okay, here's her Me Too. We all know this campaign that's circulating right now. Okay, I want to look at this one. So this, for example, okay, this was from 2012. And the Arabic basically says, okay, if you said yes like me, you wouldn't have been expelled from heaven, okay? And here we have, you know, Adam and Eve and just this squat little guy who's like very kind of proud of himself because he has voted yes in favor of the draft constitution. This is under Morsi, right? Morsi, the Islamist president who was in power for a little while. So there was a draft constitution. This guy voted in favor of yes. Some of the supporters of the referendum were quoted as saying a yes vote guarantees the voter a spot in heaven, while a no vote guarantees the voter a spot in hell, right? And this is what she's making fun of here. So you can see like neither Adam nor Eve in the cartoon say anything, but you have this guy who's sort of trying to mobilize religious discourse for his own political agenda. Okay, now she was actually charged with blasphemy in 2012 for this cartoon by a Salafist lawyer who said that she was defaming the image of Adam, right? It ended up being fine, right? But she withstood and she really didn't care and she defended herself and she said, you know, okay, legally a cartoonist may be exposed on charges of insulting the president or blasphemy, but these legal principles are broad and can be used against you anytime, as happened to me. I drew a caricature that criticized politicians taking advantage of religion and using it to dominate and influence simple people. Unfortunately, I was then accused of blasphemy. Okay, but the charges were ultimately dropped and she is still cartooning all the time, so it doesn't matter. We can look at another one that was really controversial, and this was around the same time. And yeah, this made a lot of headlines. This was published in February of 2013, right? And we can see it shows a man reaching a pair of scissors between a woman's legs to cut off a red flower, right? This is a sort of critique of female genital mutilation, right? Or clitoridectomies, right? We all know what that is. So this she published in a mainstream newspaper, and she was asked by a reporter who said, you know, you recently published a cartoon dealing with the issue of female genital mutilation. What are the consequences of addressing this issue, professional or otherwise? How common is it for cartoonists to address female genital mutilation? And she said, the caricature that I drew about female circumcision has led to controversy and shocked some people. The subject of female genital mutilation has not been handled in such a direct way before. Some readers liked the idea behind the cartoon and were motivated to demand an end to this crime, while others attacked the cartoon and rejected my decision to deal with the issue. I believe that these strong reactions to the cartoon is a good thing, whether the reaction is acceptance or rejection, right? Okay, we can take another one, right, that also was a bit controversial, but not quite as much as the other, right? Okay, so what's going on here? So we have a guy pushing a cart full of brides, right? So this is about male guardianship, right? And the question of young brides. Because there's a trend for wealthy Gulf men to travel to impoverished Egyptian rural areas to find much younger, often temporary brides. So young brides, right, these are girls who have generally just reached the legal age for marriage, which is Egypt, but whose families, who again, these are rural, poor families, right, will marry them off to these men because they're getting like a very large bride price. Yeah, so she says, okay, if a foreign man wants to marry a girl who's more than 25 years younger than him, then he is obliged to pay her family the equivalent of just over, say, $6,000, right? Which is a relatively small price for a wealthy man from the Gulf states. It's a big incentive for poor Egyptian families struggling to cope in increasingly desperate economic times. So they're basically selling these women off. But this is the thing, is that, you know, this is the stuff that she critiques, right? So she's a really, really active voice. The fact that she does it in cartoons, right? Like, this is in a way the most powerful vehicle to offer social critique in the Arab world, because one, you don't have to worry about literacy, right? Basically anybody can see these images and they can understand them, they're comprehensible, right? So even if we're talking about people in poor rural areas who maybe have varying degrees of literacy, they still have access to the social critique, the political critique that's in the images, right? So she is one of the most important you know, kind of political actors in this regard in Cairo right now. And I'm just going to end with a couple, you see some images that require little explanation. Okay, I want to just end with a few images here, again, because we have just to sort of bring home the idea of this kind of diversity of what are we even talking about when we're talking about women in the MENA region. So this is actually from a comic book festival that I attended in Cairo about a month ago, right? This was Cairo Comics, okay? So she was there and everyone was so happy that she was there. So you might notice that Doa Al-Adel is sitting on the stage, right? And what she's doing is she's cartooning live while this group, Bint al-Musarwa, which is, I think they're Lebanese, right? A kind of female pop group who they're kind of singing songs that are social critiques. So they kind of do these like funny stories and testimony about just stuff that happens to them, and then they break into song. And it's usually just about, you know, whatever, the things that happen to a woman on the street. Various forms of societal oppression or sexual harassment, et cetera, but kind of told in a funny way. And as they were singing, right, she's illustrating on screen. And, you know, I mean, you just know, like, what do these women have in common, right? I mean, like, you know, all of these women, like, okay, we have our sort of Lebanese pop group, and they're in their, like, slinky little black dresses, right, that's sleeveless, et cetera, right? And then you have Doa Al-Adel, right, who is maybe dressed in more traditional clothes, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, these are all, they're both, like, what it means to be a woman in the MENA region. Yeah. Okay, so I'll end there because I'm a couple minutes over time, though I think I'm about right? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I would just like to ask, some of the key personalities that you have presented to us are Muslim women, yeah, historically and also contemporary. Do you have any examples of probably non-Muslim Arab women that we could, know of?
Yes, there are. I mean, in what way? I would have to sort of think who is. Are you like from what, like contemporary?
Contemporary, probably those that deal with social critique, for example.
I mean, there are. I'm sure there are. I'm not always necessarily thinking about actually what religious affiliation someone has, unless, I mean, these women are particularly address Muslim issues in society, right? So I don't actually think all of the women in Bint Musarwa, I don't think all of them are Muslim, actually. But yeah, so I mean, there are, in politics there are, but I would have to, you know, kind of think like who's kind of, say, written something to give you a name. Because I'm generally, you know, what you're probably not going to find as much are Christian women specifically writing critiques of issues having to do with Islam and society. You know what I mean? Like there would be social critiques, and there are a lot of novelists, there are a lot of filmmakers, right? Especially coming from the Levant. But they're not probably going to go into that area specifically, which is what I tend to be reading. So I'm sorry, I can't offer you. But there are, I mean, if we sort of wanted to think about also, say, like novelists, right? Like many of your novelists from, say, Lebanon, for example. Also from Egypt, but specifically from Lebanon, from Palestine, many of them happen to be Christian. Questions, comments?
Hi, yeah, so, you know, in a largely patriarchal, you know, society, are there men who, speak out for women or consider themselves as feminists? I know in Lebanon you have, a band who released a new track, you know, that they call the feminist anthem of the Middle East recently. But do you see that a lot, male feminists in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, of course you do. I mean, I think especially, generationally, right? I mean, especially when you're looking at a slightly younger generation, I think it's quite common, right? And I mean, again, the issue is not always just about, say, women or feminism, right? Like, I mean, often the issue is about, say, gender, right? Because, women's issues, right, this also overlaps often with, kind of issues of kind of people who do not identify as heteronormative, right? Like, so you can take, for example, the Lebanese pop group Mashroo'a Leila, right? Where, who are like openly gay, right? And there was just a really big problem in Egypt over that exactly, right? But they would, so at the same time as they're advocating especially in the sphere of popular culture, right, for gay rights, I mean, that goes hand in hand with, say, women's rights, right, or more progressive gender politics, right? From like an older generation, you can take writers like, I would think off the top of my head, like in Egypt, Sanallah Ibrahim, right? And he's, one of these 60s generation writers. But if you were to read his novels, right, like there's a kind of, feminist politics to his novels that are as strong as any woman novelist that you're going to read. Like he's very, very progressive, right? So, you find, especially you have to think too, like, you have a wide political spectrum. So even when we talk about these things, it's hard to say what are we even talking about? Because, you have kind of feminist gender politics on the left, right? You also have, kind of a feminist politics in the different Islamist movements, right? And those two groups actually don't talk to each other a lot, right? And there's but there's a lot of their political aims in terms of gender equity in society are actually the same, right? So it's not even just the people on the left who you think that there's a big difference between, say, the people on the left and then, say, the Islamists that we tend to think of as being on the right. But if there's a really good book by, what is her name? Zakia Salim, I think, on feminist movements in Morocco, where she actually does an ethnography of the kind of secular Western-oriented feminist movements in Morocco next to the Islamist feminist movements in Morocco, right? And she spends a lot of time with both of those two groups to see like where are the overlaps in the agendas, right? And they actually they don't talk to each other, right? Because the Western-oriented feminists assume that like, okay, they're not really feminists, right? And the Islamist feminists, you know, assume that like, okay, they're just like too Western and they're not, when actually like their goals for having complete gender equity, right, are very much the same. So there's such a broad spectrum of what it might even mean to sort of think about gender politics in the Middle East, right? And we often tend to think, at least outside of, you know, the Middle East, we tend to think that, you know, okay, the progressive gender politics are all going to be on the kind of secular left, which isn't necessarily the case. Like, yes, it's there, right? But the people who are political Islamists also often have a progressive gender platform, too. So even there, right, there's a very large spectrum, right? Yeah.
I want to ask about the feminist movement in the Middle East. I know that I cannot like generalize the kind of feminist movement in the Middle East, but what I want to ask is there any some kind of alliance or cooperations or collaborations or kind of solidarity between the feminist movement in the Middle East and those in the West?
There are. That's a complicated. That's a complicated question because sometimes those solidarities work out well. Sometimes they don't work out well, right? And this is, I don't know, one of the suggested readings that was sent to you was this very short article by Maya Mikdashi on like how to not talk about gender in the Middle East. And it was just, you know, maybe 10 bullet points of things, right? And one of her points exactly is that, you know, you can't assume that the Western feminist agenda, when transplanted to the Middle East or when those solidarities are put in place, that they always actually work out well for the Middle East, or that they're always, you know, kind of capable of advancing those interests, right? And so she's someone who writes about that. Another person who has written about this in a slightly different context and to a lot of notoriety is Joseph Massad, right, who has a book called Desiring Arabs. And this got a lot of press because, and he's talking more about the exportation of gay rights movements to the Middle East, right? And he talks about something that he calls the incitement to discourse, and well, which this comes from Foucault, some of you know, right? The incitement to discourse and the gay international agenda or something like that. He sort of created this slightly nefarious sounding term, right? And his argument is he's not at all kind of anti-gay rights, right? I mean, but his reading is that when you have human rights groups who want to advance the cause of, say, gay rights in the Middle East, what that ends up doing is it ends up creating an incitement to discourse, and governments who actually were not thinking about this issue before start looking for people to punish, right? So when there had not been laws in place and they had not been kind of thinking about this as an identity category at all, right? All of a sudden, right, once you have this put on the government's agenda through the intervention of Western human rights groups, you suddenly start to have crackdowns on, you know, same-sex activity, right? So there was an incident with something called the Queen Boat in Cairo in like 2000, right? And this was a kind of gay nightclub, and it had existed for a long time, and it was exactly the result of you know, kind of pressure from Western human rights organizations that then the government had a big crackdown on this gay nightclub when before they had just been letting it be, right? So the thing is, once you get Western rights groups involved in various ways, that can sometimes lead to unintended consequences, right? So you have, for example, a lot of instances too of something called pinkwashing, you know, where you have, like, say, Israel, right, gets painted as a very progressive place in terms of gender, right? And then that ends up, you know, kind of effacing all of the real kind of political, economic forms of oppression that they actually, impose upon Palestine, right? So there, it can be, it's never a simple thing once Western rights groups get involved. Like those are always complicated solidarities, right? And so that was one of the points in that article, if you read what she's saying, is that, is that you can't assume that when you have Western feminist groups or Western gay rights groups or anything on gender, that it's just going to be a really clear and simple affair and things are going to go well. It's always complicated.
Thank you very, very much for the format of the lecture. It's really entertaining. You mentioned this hashtag #MeToo.
Yeah.
And is it, how widespread it's in Arabic segment of Facebook? Because I give you, let's say, I follow Russian Facebook. And last year we had kind of similar hashtag, but in Russian it was very popular. But this year, kind of this #MeToo is not, people not responding. How is it is it different from English segment of Facebook?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And actually, I don't know. I'd have to go and actually kind of search in Twitter and stuff and Facebook, in Arabic, and see how widespread it is. It's picked up to some degree. I think the problem is most of the people that I've seen posting are actually posting in English. So I don't know, to what degree that's actually transferred into Arabic and how widespread it is. And I should check. I just came across her cartoon yesterday. So I don't actually know. I don't know if you remember, there was another thing that happened. I don't know if it was a few years ago, where there was a woman, I think originally in New York, who kind of put a camera on her body and walked around Manhattan for hours just to accumulate all of the, vulgar things that were said to her as she was walking, and you could watch the video. Did any of you see this on? Oh, maybe it didn't make it here. It did actually make it in the Arab world, right? So when that came out a few years ago, a Moroccan woman made a Moroccan one and, put also a camera on her body and walked around, I think it was Casablanca, for hours and just recorded every, kind of bit of street harassment that she encountered during that time, and then posted it on social media so you could watch it. So, these campaigns do often kind of make it into the Arab world and also start circulating. But I have to look more, yeah.
So basically, the Arabic women will be ready to say this.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I don't think there's any shortage of testimony, right? And again, it depends on what country, right? So, even when I'm thinking okay, which countries? I guess I'm thinking mostly about, say, Egypt right now, for some reason. I guess because Doa al-Adl is in Egypt, so this is where the cartoon is from. So, if you think back to, say, 2012, right, when you had the revolution and you had all of these moments of kind of horrific sexual assault and sexual harassment, in Tahrir Square, right? A lot of which were filmed, right? And they were very public, right? There were so many testimonies that came out about that. That was all you could read on, kind of through blogs, on, kind of publications like Jadaliya, in Egyptian publications like Meda Masr, right? Which is banned in Egypt right now, but is still functioning on Facebook. So I think since the revolution, I have seen a lot of women kind of writing about experience of street harassment, through various online forums, and being very, very vocal about that, and in campaigning for it to stop. So yeah, I see women talking about this all the time. It's been something that, women have been much more vocal about in at least, say, Egypt since 2012. Whereas, it was just in the US, people started doing this a week ago or 2 weeks ago or something. I feel like this is very reminiscent of various campaigns that I've seen circulating in Arabic, especially since the Arab Spring.
I was just curious, what are or where are their sources of this feminist figures, their inspiration coming from? Is it like when they are, like contrasting the experience of women in their area with those in the West, or is it purely localized, like source of inspirations of feminist ideas?
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part of your question again?
What are or where are their sources of feminist ideas of this, the feminist figures in the Middle East?
That depends very much on the particular thinker, right? So I would say, and I think crudely put, you could say there are two schools, right? And this is exactly what Zakia Salim talks about in her book, is that you have feminists who are very, kind of well-read in Western feminist theory, right? And who are very influenced by Western feminist theory. So you could say they're building off of that, and they're very much in dialogue with that, right? Especially, kind of newer thinkers in feminist theory who are taking other types of intersectionality into account, right? Like especially when you have kind of women of color, right, who are trying to talk about, say, like not just, kind of sex, but, sexual orientation, right? Gender, sexual orientation, race, all of these things together, right? These kind of newer modes of thought, right? You definitely have people who are very, very much in dialogue with that. And someone like Nawala Saadawi was, she's older, she was very much in dialogue with, say, second wave feminism, right? Like in the West. But then you do also have other people like, say, someone like Fatima Mernissi, and this is why these are two productive examples in a way, because someone like Fatima Mernissi, the second modern person that I showed you, the Moroccan, is very much trying to work within the Islamic tradition, right? So she is not particularly interested in engaging with Western feminist theory, right? She's interested in performing a rereading of early Islamic history and of finding a way to turn, to kind of develop a specifically Islamic kind of feminism grounded in the tradition. So I would say, crudely put, you could say you have these two strands, right? You have feminists who are very much kind of looking to the West, and then you have feminists who are very much kind of looking towards the tradition.
Regarding, Aisha and Khadija that you shared, in Singapore, mainly the religious classes, they still limit, the roles of Aisha and Khadija as just, wives and mothers. They don't talk about being businesswomen or scholars, as such, regarding the issue of gender roles, in society, especially in Islamic schools in the Middle East, we did talk about, these strong female figures being just, not just being mothers and wives.
Do they talk about it, basically? That depends on where you are, right? I mean, again, like this is it completely depends on, like where are you? I mean, if you're in Saudi Arabia, probably not, right? I mean, it's going to be probably more traditional, right? It's very hard to generalize. I wouldn't say, that the focus on these figures as, kind of strong female figures is the norm, right? I wouldn't say that. But there are a lot, like more and more all the time, of, kind of women working from within the tradition who are trying to make this the focus, right? So this is exactly the investment of a lot of women like Fatima Mernissi, but others also, right, who exactly want to sort of say, like, look, the problem is we've had 1,000+ years of like strictly male interpretation. And let's focus on what actually was going on with the women, right? So there are a lot of women who are trying to, kind of bring this into relief because it is there, right? Like even when I'm reading, right, and I sort of read a lot of classical texts, right? And there are always women scholars in the classical text. I do not have texts written by the women scholars. You know what I mean? Like this is the thing, is that we don't actually have the authorship. I mean, there are a couple, but not that many. But regardless of what male scholar you're reading, whenever he's sort of writing his autobiography or scholarly autobiography, there is always a focus on women scholars. Often, it'll be like, okay, the paternal grandmother or whatever. This is always a very, very strong aspect of their education. So like, there is a scholarly tradition that was clearly there, even though it hasn't been preserved in writing to the same, to the extent that we would like, right? So this is exactly the kind of progressive Islamist, feminist movement. So it's not the norm right now. Could it be? I mean, it could be. It depends, right? I don't know how much progress these women will make, but this is a very, very important project to a lot of women right now. Yeah.